It is my great honor and privilege to introduce to the Buddhist Action Coalition's speaker series, Dr. Larry Ward. Dr. Ward is a senior teacher at the Thich Nhat Hanh Plum Village tradition of Zen Buddhism and holds a PhD in religious studies with an emphasis on Buddhism and neuroscience of meditation. He brings 25 years of international experience in organizational change and local community renewal to his work as the director of the Lotus Institute and as an advisor to the Executive Mind Leadership Institute at the Drucker School of Management. Dr. Ward is a father, a poet, and the author of this powerful book, America's Racial Karma, An Invitation to Heal. I say without hesitation, everyone needs to read this book. Dr. Ward writes, "It is more than evident that as a society, we are not okay. We are burning up and burning out. What rises from the ashes are karmic actions. As we walk forward into changing our social institutions and practices, we can also increase our awareness and turn it toward the work of healing," unquote. For many of us who are crying out for wellness and justice and sanity, we are looking at Dr. Ward to take us through a mindful process that could lead us into a fresh way of being at this moment of such great suffering. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Larry Ward.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Lenore. I'm Larry Ward. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm speaking to you today from the land of the Kumeyaay and Lesotho people, also known as the San Diego area. I want to begin with a poem. We are not going mad because something is wrong with us. We are going mad because our view of humanity is too narrow. We have been told that reality exists in pieces, but we are a species like all species, created by millions of interactions across time and space, both visible and invisible. We keep falling into our wounds as the definition of ourselves. We keep hyping greed as if it is noble. We keep watering seeds of hate as the meaning of power and addiction to the delusions of the mind. These are all tragic substitutes for the true preciousness of our lives. We live in a state now of continuous shock. The echoes of uncertainty bouncing around in our heads and the bitter streams of reactivity filling our veins with fear and anger and violence and sorrow. But the shaking you may feel under your feet is the sound of a new cloth being woven out of our pain. The earth is helping us to remember the reality of our connection to all beings. I invite you to stand up in the house of belonging, no longer hiding. Surrender to the truth for the sake of our shared wellness. We say we do not know how to cease this illness. Sometimes it seems like our spiritual landscapes have become parched like deserts, full of dust. Sometimes it seems the way has been stolen or lost, and that true maps have vanished. But we are not lost. We are blind, convinced by the illusion that only one can win, that winning really matters. We see so very little of this world. If we are to survive ourselves, from ourselves, with ourselves, we must step into a greater courage of creating new narratives a little bit everywhere new relationships, making dance and sounds and stories of our deep connections, our implicit connections, and release the thunder of our kinship that has been denied. And from this place, the sacred energies of imagination can flow. We are not mad because something is wrong with us. We are mad because something is right with us. We are connected and always have been meant to live a whole life. And a life of giving to wellness, making justice, and making harmony. No, we are not going mad because something is wrong with us. We're going mad because something is right with us. We don't yet know how to be together. So I'm meditating and working on a new book that appeared in my consciousness through my practice and through my study and through my work on America's racial karma. And I'm using the working title right now of One Nation Under Trauma in a World Under Trauma. And well, and I won't be saying something you don't already feel in your body, sense deep in the spaces of your heart, and echoes of your own mind. The worldwide COVID pandemic has killed so many human beings, none of us really know how to imagine it. We really don't know how to imagine millions and millions of lives just disappearing. We've done over 600,000 here in the U.S. lives have been lost due to the pandemic. And every now and then I say to people, if the pandemic was a teacher, if the pandemic was a guru, it would be trying to teach us we are on one planet from which there is no escape. And we are here together, and either we learn really fast how to be together in ways that are not colonial, not imperial, not patriarchal. If we don't learn how to step into what is our own inheritance, we will not survive. The second thing that's part of our moment of trauma, and I'll say what I mean by trauma in a minute. I just want to make sure it's grounded in our experience. The crisis, our species crisis across the planet, the disappearance of species, more species than we can again imagine. There's a chart I came across in preparing and working with ecological communities and networks and groups that showed how much time human beings have been a species on the earth, and mapped that against other species on the earth. And compared to other species on the earth, human beings have been here about 11 seconds. And look at what we have done to this planet, to the species on this planet, to the peoples on this planet, in 11 seconds. And to think that the earth and the trauma to the earth and the species is not permeating us is not to be in touch with reality. Because we've been trained that life is only matter, which is, of course, not in line with the laws of thermodynamics, but that we are also energy. And so trauma is not just what happens outside of you. Trauma is what happens inside of you because of what happened outside of you. It's a happening inside of a happening. And that happening can be big or small or natural or human created or naturally in terms of the geology of things. I've been in earthquakes and other things like that. And so by trauma, I mean our nervous system goes offline with its regulation. Our sense of well being and our capacity to be stable and grounded and with high cognitive awareness is lost when we are in a state of traumatic activation. Third thing on my list is the democratic nations, quote unquote, around the world. Their institutions have been revealed to be entrenched in dysfunction and despair, except for those profiting from the dysfunction and despair. The reckoning of 500 years around or longer, depending on how far you want to go back, of race and gender and other colonial legacies and narratives about who and what we are and what we're capable of are coming unglued, are melting like the iceberg that we know just broke off and is melting. Last week I had a chance to be online with some friends in Argentina and in Colombia, discussing their practitioners, and they were talking about how they are practicing with the chaos where they live, and police on the streets, military on the streets, people calling for justice, for wellness, for care, for systems that promote life instead of promote death. And that shift of millions of people around the world is happening at this very moment. But because we've been trained to see things in pieces, we never see the whole cloth. And I've had the good fortune of living and working around the world most of my adult life. And I can tell you, there's a lot of absolutely marvelous, transformational, and healing things going on around this planet. But you know, our nervous system, thanks to evolution, is designed to notice what is negative first because it might impact our safety. And so the way our brain operates, if something negative happens, or even if we think something negative will happen, it becomes front and center. And it becomes very difficult for any positive energy to break through the wall of negativity that's set up in our nervous system. So part of spiritual practice for me is spending energy investing in uplifting myself so that I can be with negative energy and not run from it. So I can be with without being engaged in, which is really the great trick, in my opinion. I see so many of us and I have been engaged in actions my whole life, as you have, and how easy it is to forget that when we engage in suffering outside of our own, we also are interacting with that suffering. People's stories, people's fears, people's hopes, people's dreams get placed onto some of us. In the meanwhile, we're still working with our own hopes and our own dreams and our own fears, and none of it can we do perfectly. And that realization, for me, I call the Bodhisattva Sorrow. And by that I mean, and that's just my language, in Bodhisattva literature and in different Buddhist traditions, it would be referred to, it's the quality of the Bodhisattva who keeps returning because the work is never done. The effort to carry human beings and all beings across the bitter ocean of suffering is never done. And this is what I mean by sorrow. When you wake up and realize, oh no, the work it's a process, not a goal. It's a practice. I've been working with some dear colleagues on beginning to understand solidarity as a spiritual practice. Part of what's happened to us, in my critique of the colonial framework we still are in, by the way, is that we are positioned to measure everything. We're positioned to judge everything. We're positioned to evaluate everything in terms of its value, when in fact one of the greatest tragedies of the colonial framework is the dictation of human value. And much of our psychology is built on that. Without looking deeper, we are not simply our traumas. They are experiences in our life. I just rewatched again in preparation for Juneteenth activities this weekend, I Am Not Your Negro by James Baldwin story. If you haven't seen it, look at it again. And much of that I lived through, but even looking at it again, aspiration that came up. And I'm grateful that I know how. So when I see a scene in Alabama or Tennessee or the Roberts Hotel where Martin Luther King was assassinated that I've also stayed in, it activated my aversion to America and deactivated my affection. So learning how to practice with encountering suffering outside of ourselves is the key to sustained action over time, so that we don't blow in or blow out or blow up. So it's the Bodhisattva to be like the moon, to be like the sun, not simply like a comet. Because you can already know, and our ancestors whisper this in our ears every night, this is a journey that we're on together. People are not accepting around the world old ways of doing things. And it's just the power of our brains around habit really makes it difficult for us to shift. And especially when we institutionalize those neurons and give them power and financial resources to do with whatever they think they should do. But the nerve cells in our brains are plastic. They are capable of being changed and shaped and reformed into new clusters, into new connections of communication and energy and insight. But it takes conscious effort to do that rewiring work so that we can elevate ourselves. I don't think we are the summit of evolution myself. And it's okay, I'm okay with people who think we are, but I don't have any evidence. And I study history and many other disciplines, and I study the natural world every day in my meditations. And I watch how plants grow, and I watch how trees cooperate. And I stay with birds and deer and fox, etc., and trees and flowers and cactus, and I see the natural world. Our way of being is not natural. And this is why we are sick. We have created our own maps as if they are reality, when the actual reality we're living in has so much to teach us. And of course, you know this in chemistry and medicine and even in cosmetics. We're taking things from the natural world in herbs and spices. And so, but that's just the level of matter. Again, things we can count, things we can see, things we can sell. But we have to go deeper and learn how to be present with nature as our spiritual friend, as a teacher, in an understanding that We are not smarter than the worm. We have lots of succulents here in our little patio, and every day I go out in the morning and there is either the same or a new snail coming for a snack on one of our plants. And the snail responds the same way we do as human beings when we experience stress. The first thing it does is it hides. It becomes immobile. It doesn't move. In resilience and trauma terms, it's frozen or stuck. And that is not wrong. That is a natural, wise survival response to freeze, to pause, just like the snail did, until I went away, and then it came back out and continued on its journey in a different direction. That's natural. That's nature. And we're learning how to handle our frozenness, for me, is one of the fundamental issues of American society, of modern society, I should really say. We don't know how to handle our numbness, our experience of being disassociated from what we see and what we hear in this world, and even in our own lives. On a daily basis, we are experiencing, the collapse of old identity frameworks. And this is not just personal. This is institutional, geographical, discipline-wise, music-wise, food-wise, old paradigms of what gets mixed with what, and what can get created out of what, is in a revolution of creativity. And it's important for me to remember that's going on at the same time the mess we are in is going on. Grace Lee Boggs often reminded us that while you need to keep your eye focused on justice, on the immediate issues in your society, in your community, you must also have a long-term vision. So when I work, I'm on an advisory board of a school in Bangkok, international school, and over the last year we did a process of asking students what kind of education did they want. What do they want to learn? What was easy for them? What was difficult for them? What do they need support? We asked the parents the same thing. We asked the teachers the same thing, separately. And then we got all the data together and discovered they were basically saying the same thing. And they were really surprised, because all their voices were able to come and be expressed in a way for them that was safe expression. So people tended to be really open with what they said, children included. It's a wonderful process. So these old frames are collapsing. Brexit was one indication of that. What happened here in the U.S. is another indication of that. January 6th is another. You can keep going on. What's happening in Colombia? What happened just now in Peru with the election? And so around the world, people in Japan, who everybody perceives as, misperceives, I should say, are out in conflict with the International Olympic Committee. And you know what that is, right? You know this is all commercial. This is about money and the law, and so they sign the contract. They don't get to decide whether to do the Olympics or not. The International Committee gets to decide. And for me, that is the old framework. Dismissive, disregard. What could the worst case, even a medium worst case scenario out of the Tokyo Olympics is horrifying. But this is the narrative we are trying to shift in our own lives, in our communities, and in places around the world. We are in what someone calls a neuro-existential crisis. And somebody asked me, what do you mean by trauma? A trainer asked me, what do you mean by that? Well, to me, it means all the few traumas I've listed. I'm not counting mass shootings every day, people shot in the grocery store, at a convenience store today for not, somebody asked a person to put on a mask, they went back out to their car, came back in and killed the person behind the counter. We are unhinged. This is what I mean by a neuro-existential crisis. We are in a space where our nervous systems cannot handle the chaos we now experience. Whether that's the chaos at home, the chaos in our community, the chaos in our nation. And so we're seeing trauma reactions to the chaos. One is to hide, is to freeze. That's the negative side of immobilization. The positive side of immobilization is to rest and take care of yourself. The next area, which is where most of the colonial frame has positioned us in terms of a nervous system view, is we are constantly in the fight mode or the flight mode. Let me get away from this chaos, or let me fight to try to change this chaos. And when we're in either immobilization, that state of our nervous system, or in activation of fight or flight energies, we cannot hear each other. We cannot listen to one another. We can't even understand what we are saying ourselves, let alone what someone else might think we're saying. You've had this experience when your nervous system was activated, where you were angry or afraid or scared, and our cognition, our best capacity for cognition goes offline. Our capacity to make wise choices in the moment is lost. Our sense of well-being in the moment is lost. We are overcome with threat. And the thing we know from the practice of Buddhism is threat can not only be external, actually there, threat can also be imagined. And part of that imagining has to do with your own conditioning. So part of our practice is to recognize in our own mind and in our own sensory system of our body how we have been conditioned around safety. How do we know we're safe? Do we recognize safety in our body when we experience it? If we find ourselves feeling unsafe, do we have practices to help us come back to a safe zone inside without being frozen, without being hyperactivated? And we do in our collective traditions have such practices, which to me, if we combine them with what we now know about the nervous system and the brain, we can accelerate our self-regulation to what I want to call high-level self-regulation. Self-regulation is, being able to be stable enough to go through daily life without major problems or creating major problems, being able to handle your problems. But when you're out of your zone, even if the peanut butter jar doesn't open right, you get angry. This is how it's always the little things. To stay in touch with your body, stay in touch with your sensations, not to run from them, but to let them come and use that energy to rise, not to judge. Because this experience we're having is a profound human experience. We come from a period in the Western world of hundreds of years that was really had a principle that was the taboo of subjectivity. And women primarily suffered under that lie. Your feelings don't matter. You can't be having this experience. And when I did my research, which I've kind of always done on African American experience, the whole idea that black people don't have the same pain thresholds as white people. I mean, it's just delusional. The structure of human status created 700 years ago, 500 years ago, we still operate out of it. We are still driven by status, by notions of competition, notions of something there's to win or to lose. And all these traumatic things are happening at the same time. That's the crisis. Our nervous system, designed by evolution, is designed for a quick response to threat or stress. It is not designed to experience 24 hours a day, 7 days a week chaos, which is the world we now live in, which is the country we now live in. So when I cut on the news in the morning, which I do as a part of my spiritual practice, I don't know what dystopian experience I'm going to have of what the society of America is like. Who will get shot? Who will do the shooting? Kids? Children? Adults? Where? Any place. And I've always had to be conscious my whole life about my surroundings and where I go. And I've been all over the place. I won't go through my story. That's not important. But what is important is that our practice, our somatic practice, our mindfulness of the body practice is, for me, the foundation of where the new world is born. Many philosophers and teachers and leaders and spiritual people, poets, over many, many years have had great visions of what's possible for human society. And a few years ago, I was invited to be on a panel with James Lawson, who was the man Martin Luther King selected to go to India to study with Gandhi to learn the nonviolence method that he brought back to train the civil rights movement in. And I was on a panel with a priest and an imam and a shaman and a herbalist. And our question was, what is justice in your tradition? So everybody got to give a little talk about what justice meant in their tradition. And James Lawson was last, and the moderator, and he said, I have to pause, because we all were saying the same thing. So why haven't we been able to achieve this if we're clear? And so I'm kind of slow, so I meditated on that question for a whole year. and at the same time, I decided to continue my neuroscience training to go into learning everything I could about trauma and resilience in the human body. And during that year, the penny dropped. We are not capable, we don't have a nervous system yet capable of realizing our best visions for ourselves. But we do have a nervous system capable of becoming one that can hold a planetary consciousness, that can hold grief and sorrow and love and care and renewal and repair for one another. We can do that. There are examples of history and people who have done that. Our dilemma is we have to figure out how enough of us collectively have enough energy going in that direction so we don't self-destruct. You know, many societies, most societies live in a psychosocial trance of their society. we just do what we've been taught to do, and the more often we've done it, the more we perceive that the world we're in now is the way the world was meant to be and always will be. And that is coded in our nervous system. It's coded in our neurons with stories and images and sounds, and in our mind with theories and concepts and language. So for me, we have a fertile field of recreating ourselves. We need new language to describe what it means to be a human being. We need new language to describe how we are not in pieces, and that the young children who last week with the AK-47 and an armed gun, a young woman and a young man, 12 and 14, shooting at the police, we tend to look at that as an isolated event. It is not. It's amazing to me. We think of people as influencers, but we don't think of our society as an influencer. Where else in the world would that happen? Where else are children afraid to go to school, or are going to school in flak jackets like they're in the military? And to pretend that this is normal is what is crashing down upon us. But that crashing down, don't worry, that is the nature of things to crash down. I had a rose bush I took care of for a long time when I lived in Taos, New Mexico, and the first few months I realized it had the ability to let go and create new at the same time. This is what we must learn how to do individually and as fast as we can collectively. To let go and create. This is not just about destruction. Destruction is easy. This creation is hard. It's imagination that takes courage. Anybody can critique the mess we are in, because there's so many levels and so many messes. But what kind of society do we want? What kind of, and I'm not talking about, we have to come up with new language, because if we use any old language, it already has a response. That's conditioning. That is mental states that have been turned into traits. Mental states of greed, mental states of uncontrolled desire, mental states of pride in the worst sense of pride, meaning dominance. These mental states get turned into traits, and these traits are stored in our nervous system, in our body as well as in our mind. And in Buddhism we talk about the mind as in mental formations. And so learning how to excavate what we need to let go of, and to do it with kindness and not judgment and not hatred of ourselves or a hatred of anybody else, is key to this transformation I think we're in, to build a high level of self-regulation skills and attitudes so that we can reach a high level of co-regulation skills together. And as we reach that, then we have a chance to go to the third level, which is co-creation. And from there, co-evolution. Because for me, these are the levels that are happening. I think the last thing I would say is we need, I mentioned before, but new narratives. Think of where in your life and in your organization and in your work where a new story needs to be told, a new frame needs to be put around things so they can be seen from a perspective of wholeness, not simply injury. or what some people call woundology. And so I did a meditation over the last several weeks on this woundology and injury in terms of the body and how it impacts the nervous system and our stress, etc. And the more I meditated on it, I realized that language and that habit is military. It's patriarchal. And our modern psychology is, if it doesn't go deep enough, stays there in the wound, like that's all we are. Someone asked me, I think I was in Atlanta, what did I think about equality in terms of the law? And well, one thing I think I learned in South Africa a few years ago, in Botswana and in South Africa, from one of the professors involved in the reconciliation work. And she says the law is very important, and we must make sure it is applied with equity and equanimity, because it is not very often applied that way. The second thing they discovered is that even when the law is adequately applied, the law does not equal justice. Justice is deeper than the law. Justice goes to how we resonate with our own hearts and minds together with the result of our life and the lives of others. So I'm kind of working on a way to help us see. My narrative work right now is on creating a narrative so that we see that we are a biological, psychological, social, historical, technological, conscious, natural being, and that all of that circle interacts at every moment. So I can't blame the 2 young children in Florida who had the guns as if that was something that just happened. I have to ask myself, where did they grow up? I have to ask myself, how did a 12-year-old learn how to fire an AK-47? Where did a 14-year-old girl learn how to handle a handgun like that? And where did the image, the aspiration, the attitude to shoot at others come from? We are so fixated on being individuals in this culture that we have denied the systemic nature of our own existence, and it is killing us. We just love to blame somebody and then think the problem's gone away. No, we arrest and prosecute, and all of which is necessary and good, police officers who are not well, and I'll just leave it at saying not well in their duties and in their life, without asking ourselves, how did that officer get to be that way? I've worked with the police before in different parts of the U.S. I've worked with gang leaders. I've worked with all kinds of people around the world. And one of the first things I try to do is just listen to see what I can learn about what conditions created their suffering, or what conditions created their perceived suffering. And then in that, see where I can find my heart, find my care, find my love for all beings, and put it into action. We are really, really on a tightrope of not being able to handle the uncertainty we all experience in today's world. And our response to that uncertainty is to kill anything that we think might add more to it. To dismiss, to eliminate, also to kill. I remember when someone bombed our house, and no, it's kind. It's the first not the first time somebody tried to get me to go away earlier than later, but it's still shocking and sad and tragic. And so when I found out a little bit from the police after the bombing, who it was, et cetera, I decided to look into that. Now, who would try to kill me that way? I found out a lot of abused human beings, traumatized human beings. And you must understand that all of us are under trauma. No one is escaping this. Your reactivity at home, your shortness in conversation, your sense of being behind and having to catch up and be in a hurry, your sense of trying to avoid confrontation and difficulty and find comfort is all a sign of what we're living in. And the practice for me is to activate this third state of our nervous system, which in the polyvagal theory is called the ventral. But it is to practice to elevate our nervous system to experience stabilized peace. Not People Magazine peace. I mean, body-centered, grounded sensations running through your veins, the experience of being here and now. And when I am here and now, I am also able to touch everything around me in a different way, see everything around me in a different way. I practice this when I go to approach the news, and so I see the news in a different way. I don't see it as a single isolated event. I see it as an eruption in Indra's net around the planet, a disruption of our being. And the Huayan tradition in Buddhism talks about the interpenetration of reality. And we have designed a society in the belief and in the mechanisms and systems who ignores that reality. The two young men, or not so young men in Missouri, who have been found completely innocent of the crime they were charged with, fully documented, the police were involved in paying somebody to testify against them. Together they've been in jail 70 years combined. And even though they're completely innocent, according to the prosecutors and everyone else in the system, the governor will not let them out of prison. That's the country we're in. And so anytime you think that putting on your rose-colored glasses, don't. Put on your clear ones. Put on your wisdom glasses. And by wisdom, again, I simply don't mean judgment. I mean looking deep. What kind of a society would do that? Martin Luther King used to talk about his greatest fear for the United States was that we would never develop any genuine morality. And that anything is possible as long as I get what I want. Anything can be manipulated, any game can be conned, any theft is okay, and we were rewarding all the behaviors that if we continue to reward, we will not survive. Remember being in school when, if I'm so old, I remember this, but being in school when the teacher focused on the red marks, on what you did wrong, on where you failed. We come from a culture like that. In business, it's called Theory X. Every employee is a potential thief. We still have people operating out of these and making decisions out of these assumptions. We see it in Congress, we see it in the Senate, and so stop acting like that's not happening. I think the call for our great task is to create a nervous system in ourselves capable of creating and sustaining our sense of wholeness with one another and with the planet. And in Greek or Latin, a phrase associated with something like this is called Anima Mundi, world soul. And some people have described it as never before opportunity for human species to create a sense of connection together that transcends all of our labels, all of our boundaries, all of our stories, all of our tragedies, so we can heal one another. We have so much talent in this world. I have met so many people, and I've walked out of villages, I've walked out of meetings with people in villages, in countries, in communities, and companies, and Fortune 500 companies, and I've walked out and said, we have so much talent. We could do this. This is not hard in terms of our talent base. What is difficult is changing the narrative. The story we have about human status, human value, the value of a life. A few years ago, I decided I wasn't going to ever refer to myself as an employee. I don't know. I woke up one morning and was like, what? Who decided that's the summary of my life? So whenever I see a label, I'm an African American, among other things. So I was giving a lecture at a School of Theology once for a big event in Washington, D.C. a few years ago, and I have different clothes from around the world that have been gifted to me, and I was wearing one of my jackets from China, from a temple I studied and spent time with there. And one of my oldest friends showed up there, walked up to me, hadn't seen me in 20 years, and he says, are you Chinese? And I said, well, sometimes. Sometimes. We have to drop below these fictitious labels and go deep within our own humanity, and we will find what we need because it's already there, but we don't have a story to let us embrace it. We have names for people who care, and very few are positive. So we have big language work to experiment, to throw out, to create stories and cartoons and films. All this is happening, but much, much more can be done. So I'm what's the right way to say this? I'm a person who hopes against being hopeful. So, and because I think being confused is more dangerous. We must be clear what's at stake at this moment. And our indigenous friends here, our native friends here, remind us all the time that when we gather and when we think of the future, we need to think of the next 7 generations. And if we're not thinking of the next, if we don't have a narrative that big, you understand what I'm saying? So many of us, our narrative goes to the mall and back. That is not creating a sustainable civilization. For alone, you can see the malls closing. This is how we know that's not the way. I think this Anima Mundi, this new world soul, for me is a vibration. It is not some entity. It is a vibration. It is a sense of flow between us. It is a sense of kinship that we have been denied. We all think we're so different from one another. And you know what I've discovered? Behind every face, every skin tone, every set of eyes and ears and age and height and weight, there's a nervous system where we live our daily lives. And if we dare have the courage to elevate our nervous system along with the vision for the future we hold dear to our hearts, however large or small that vision might be, our brains will shift. And the energy that can come from that shift, both in our brain and in our body, can release remarkable power to accelerate our consciousness in a way that's embodied, not abstract, but we can sense, we can touch. This new world soul is an emerging story of being earthlings, being planetary people. I have a dog named Charlie. He's 18, and he's aging. That's kind of funny to say because so am I. and so we all, and every morning I do a meditation on the 5 remembrances from the Buddhist tradition, and the first one starts with, I am of a nature to grow old. I cannot escape growing old. The next one is, I'm of a nature to get sick, to get ill. I'm vulnerable, physically, mentally. The third one is, I'm of a nature to die. I can't escape death. So let's just stay with those 3 for a moment. And is those 3 at the core of the existential escape in the ground of America? Our inability to grow up into the maturity of facing life as it is. And facing life as it is facing death. Now, we don't seem to have a problem with other people's death, but we have a problem with our own death of institutionality, our death of racism and sexism and homophobia and abuse of our children. Just to name, there was a recent study last week that mass shootings statistically are often connected to domestic violence. This is another example of what I mean, of thinking we're in pieces. We are not. Every part of our life affects every part of our life. And we need new narratives and new ways of understanding our disciplines in academia and in medicine that is not just pieces. And we have roots for this. Ancestors have trained us in some of these areas, whether it's Chinese medicine or Hindu, etc. You can go around the world and find, or Japanese, you can find, or Africa, you can find this sense of a whole approach. It doesn't eliminate our suffering, but it gives us the skills and the attitude to not be destroyed by it. It gives us the skills and attitudes and energy to actually take our own suffering into our heart and feel everyone else's suffering. So compassion is born. So I'm working on reconstructing myself, and I'm learning a lot about myself. You know, today I just woke up and realized, oh boy, I didn't really do that very well. So whenever I have an insight like that, I'm like grateful. I don't go into bad Larry or this was terrible. I was like, oh, I just learned something very important for my life. That's how we need to approach our learning journey. Not as guilt and condemnation. 2 of the most prominent practices in Western civilization. So I think we're about out of time, or near time, or I don't have to keep talking.
It's up to you, Dr. Ward. If you
I'm
want
quite
to
all
keep,
right with question and answers if there are some.
yeah, if you want to keep talking, or we can open it up to questions.
I'm good with questions.
All right. We're going to use the hand up method, and that'll cue the question line. I just wanted to, as I have the mic open right now, I just wanted to point out something as I've seen a lot of your interviews, that because of the content of your book is so, I don't know how you fit so much into 126 pages. It's like this book should weigh like 37 pounds or something, you know? But something, as I was reading this, I kept saying to myself, and because I'm a graduate student currently, and academia speak could be so dry and painful, that you are an elegant writer, and that it was a strange experience that I was having of the joy of reading the flow of your words.
Thank you.
But at the same time, you know, hard content, you know, so it was like this simultaneous experience of like wretched joy, you know. But I in all the interviews I've ever seen, I don't think I've ever noticed that anybody really pointed out how elegant your writing is. So I just wanted to bring that up before we, because of the content, you know, we're going to move right into the content, but I think it's overlooked and needed to be pointed out.
Thank you very much.
All right. Okay. So let me just find
we have a hand up, Eric Genjo.
Oh, Genjo, my friend Genjo. Oh, okay. So Genjo, can you unmute?
So Dr. Ward, beautiful talk, and this idea that we have to shift our narratives and we can't. We have to stop looking at instances as, oh, that just happened and it's somehow not connected to everything else. Of course, it's connected to everything else. We have to learn how to let ourselves see in that way on all these different channels, as it were, of who we are. And holistically look at our sickness is the only way to possibly recover and to evolve. But I'm looking for you right now ideas. You know, we have this systemic racism that has just infected everything. I mean, not just in this country, but let's just take this country for example. It's in our education system, it's in our legal system, it's in our medical system. I mean, it's just everywhere. How do we burn off this systemic racism when it's so entrenched?
Well, my thank you for your wonderful comments and question. For me, and I don't mean this lightly, I think the way we do that is through spiritual practice. And I say that because political practice is not enough. We can burn it off by learning how to process our trauma. So for me, I've spent the last 10 years learning technically how to work with my own trauma, how to work with other people. So for me, learning the skills, becoming trauma informed in our meditation practice and in our personal and professional lives is very, very important. But also, so is the narrative we create about what we're doing and why, and how our narratives can either help us heal or not. I think the other thing we have to do, you know, I saw an interview recently of Harry Belafonte and Noam Chomsky and some others, and he was asked, it was on the anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination here in the U.S., and actually not much coverage was given to that, I noticed. And And he said Martin Luther King's greatest fear, and Harry's not the only source I heard that from, but was that America would never develop a moral compass. That, to use language from the Christian tradition that Martin was familiar with, that America, if it didn't change, was going to become a Sodom and Gomorrah, a wasteland full of unhappiness and sorrow and frustration. And my last view with Harry wasn't that especially encouraging. and re-looking at I'm Not Your Negro again this morning was also not especially encouraging for me. And so that's what I mean. I hope, but I hope against hope. So I don't hide from what's possible here, because we have a history. So for me, that's why the issue is capability. We can have the vision, we can have the hope, but unless we train our minds and train our bodies to be able to behave differently with a vision of the new in the body as we behave, it will not occur. Our habit energy, systemically, collectively, and personally, you know, our brain likes to do things as simple as it can. It'll just keep repeating things. I go to work the same way, I cook rice the same way, I take care of the roses, my kids. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's not a way to sustain a living society, which is a living being, not simply a social construct.
So I've devoted my life, as I know many other people on this call, to spiritual life and to processing trauma and helping others find a spiritual life and to process trauma. Is there more that we can do besides politically in those three things?
Well, I can tell you what I'm working on. So I am learning how to develop what I'm calling right now an eco-based spirituality. And it's the largest place. I have a professor friend who just sent me a paper she wrote, and the title is "The Whole Earth is My Monastery." So for me, this is another shift in my perception of practice. So that everywhere I go, whether it's to school or to work, I need in myself to have the energy of a monk. And I don't mean a male monk, I mean a monastic energy, an energy of stability and kindness that is capable of dismantling things and remantling things at the same time. This is very hard. We've never successfully done it. We really haven't been trained on how to fall apart and fall together. We also need some training on grief work. We need individual understandings of how to handle our own grief. And we have no clue in this country how to handle collective grief. We hardly recognize we have such a thing as a collective energy, a collective psyche. But that's where we have to do the work, because when you start pushing up against change, that's what we keep running into. I have a great book that covers the history of African American experience, and you can find all kinds of wonderful treasures that do this, whether it's progress and pushback, progress and pushback, progress. So we hit a capacity window and we go backwards. We have Reconstruction and the Klan is born. We have Barack Obama and Trump is born. That's a wall of our capacity being stuck in a habit that has meaning and profit and pleasure for some people. So I can't leave it up to somebody else to do that work. So I'm trying to do that work on myself, to learn how to excavate my own self, how to love myself better, more wholly, more completely. So for me, without developing a new relationship with the natural world, we will not shift our notion of human superiority, which is also a part of our problem. the more time I spend practicing in nature and meditation and contemplation and laying with trees and talking with dogs and cats and birds and agapanthus, and the more I discover I'm just one among many. Not superior, but here. With gifts and talents, we're a clever species, and that's part of what makes us most dangerous.
It ends up making us arrogant. By the way, my
Yeah.
dog's name is Charlie too.
Oh, great.
And thank you for your answer.
Sure. So I'm trying to work this on myself, and most of us know, in terms of our action patterns, the frame. I started on a paper I never finished called What White Supremacy Wants for Us, and basically it wants us to either burn out, burn in, or become so conflicted with our differences among each other we give up, or we hurt each other. That's always been the plan. There's nothing new there. I lived through this in the 60s, where we were being infiltrated. Every group was being infiltrated. Stokely's group, black nationalism, Islam, everybody was being infiltrated, FBI and all these characters. That's what governments do. But the agenda was to get us not to be in solidarity. That's always the agenda for those in power in relationship to those who are not. So for me, the work is around solidarity and how we can build solidarity with one another, with enough of us fast enough around this world to move forward into something that hasn't happened before. And the practice can give us the skills of handling uncertainty. That's one of the most important things for me about the Buddhist practice. And we live in a society that cannot handle it. And will say yes to anything that makes them feel like it's going to take that experience of being uncertain about life away. Uncertain about my status away, uncertain about my power away, uncertain about my wealth away. And as long as we feed that, it'll keep growing. So I look at my own life and I ask myself, how can I stop feeding that in myself? How can I stop feeding that where I shop, where I live, who I talk to, how I interact, etc. So for me, every action is a social action. There's not some social action. Not social action. How could that be? Every action has an influence on each of us, our planet, and our communities, whether we live long enough to see the consequences of that action or not.
Thank you.
Sure.
Katie, I'm going to call on you next.
Hi,
Thank you
Katie.
so much. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. How you doing?
Hi, Dr. Ward. So I'm doing well. So good to see you. Thank you so much. I just have a question. I know there's probably not a simple answer, but I would love to hear your thoughts.
Okay.
I can't tell whether this smartphone is a friend or foe in this effort to learn how to co-regulate our nervous systems and co-create and co-evolve. Sometimes it feels like it's one of the most dysregulating beings, forces in my life. And then other times it feels profoundly co-regulating to be connecting with people from all over the world. So I'm just like, advice, thoughts?
Well, my thought about that comes from my experience, and one of the frameworks I use is from practicing with the 5 hindrances. There's some teachings and sutras and stuff on that. And what I've learned is, and this is how I try to practice with it can be both, like everything. And what I've learned is the question I ask myself, how much time am I giving it? How much? And the next question is how frequent? And so when, we get feedback from our phones, it'll say, you only spent so much time on me last week or whatever. I watch that. And I try to make sure I don't spend more time than I need to. I actually cut my phone off. And in California, that's like, killing somebody. I had people like, really, I called you and your phone wasn't on. I said, no, it wasn't on. If you want to talk to me, make an appointment and we can chat. We have to take our boundaries back from technology because it also influences our biology. And Katie, you're right. And when one of the young children in Florida with the weapons was asked, where'd you learn to do this? They said, we learned online. And you've seen the social contract. You've seen all those movies about artificial intelligence and its function. If you haven't, you really need to. Otherwise, you don't understand what we're living in. I mean, I'm just astounded at the world we are actually living in, which is quite contrary to what we see on our screens. But yes, Katie, what I do is I monitor myself. And sometimes, today I had some important calls to make, and my phone was a blessing. Other times it's going off, and it's not even it's an artificial intelligence system responding to me because my phone it doesn't even know there is a me. And the way I realized technology had this role is one of my dear friends passed away 7 years ago, and I found her a year later still on Facebook. Technology is not personal. It is systemic. And so we must be careful how we use it and how it uses us. I'm not going into all the information we're giving away and how we get marketed, and our news is scripted for where we live. But we must be intelligent about these things if we're going to do actions, for me, that move us forward and not just repeat the pattern.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Similar to regulating our nervous system.
Yes, it is. It's the same thing. So I ask myself at the end of the day, and I go into my evening meditations, how much time did I spend caring for myself today? When I was younger, many years ago, I used to ask myself, what did I do today? That's a different question. So I've shifted my question at the end of the day. I don't really care what I accomplish. Being alive is already, to me, a complete miracle. So what else could be more important? And so just to remember how precious your life is and give that attention. If you don't know what, some people write to me and say, I don't know what is nourishing. This is part of our traumatic conditioning, is we have lost sight of what gives us meaning, what gives us peace, what gives us depth, not simply excitement. There's a young woman who has a wonderful talk on meaning on YouTube. I don't remember her name, but she grew up in a Sufi family, but it's on meaning and it's worth listening to. And her premise, which I agree with, is that we've been thinking we have a problem in happiness, but our problem is really with meaning. Loss of purpose, loss of sense of belonging, loss of direction, loss of transcendence. So again, I want to come back to how important the practice is in our action, to bring in our action whatever it is, whether we're protesting or marching or sitting or writing or scripting or filming, whatever we are doing, bring your energy of your vision of the new into your body. And I told a friend of mine earlier today, I'm really looking at how to come up with a way with cartoons and other graphic images to communicate what I'm trying to say right now. because I think words are a little much for most people, unless they're crazy like me.
Dorothea?
Hi, Eric.
Hi.
I just want to say I have a lot of questions, but I don't think I can articulate them. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for this talk tonight and for your book and for mentioning Rudyard Kipling's poem in there. I'm from the Philippines, and I really do appreciate it.
Yes, good. I've been to the Philippines many times. I used to live in Hong Kong.
Yes. And thank you for giving us that internationalist perspective.
Sure.
Being in America where we think that we are it.
Yeah, with center of the universe problem.
So thank you so much.
Sure, thank you. So it is a fresh course on Copernicus, so that we understand what the center. Anyway.
Right. Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Rachel?
Well, hello, Rachel.
Hi, Larry and Dr. Ward.
Haven't seen you in a long time.
Yeah, well, I've been around since the pandemic a little bit.
Good.
Yeah. Anyway, it's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
I appreciate your talk and your book. Well done. Another book. This is a very, of course, timely book, and of course, I'm familiar with your story. And I don't know if you remember, but I grew up in the South, and I grew up in a family that was inherently racist. But how I grew up, the racism was only towards African Americans. That's it, not towards other races. And one of the things that I understand, but it's hard for me to communicate with like other white women, because other white women, a lot of white women, voted for Trump, for instance, to politicize it. And so my question is, what would you recommend to say to them, to women who, like, for instance, my mom, she's finally kind of come around and she's saying, I'm not really racist. I don't really have anything against people of color. I'm just, it's how we were raised, which I know that the dialogue behind the scenes is, when someone of color would leave the room, the things that they would say would not be nice. And so I've always spoken up. Since I was 6 years old, I've spoken up. But they are invested in the patriarchal system that we have because it works for them.
Exactly.
They're the beautiful women who are the arm candy.
Right.
What do we have? What can we do? What can we give them to show them that they can move away from that whole system?
Well, one of the things I would share is another book on women who own plantations. We have an image of the master as male only, and it's some of the most how to say this, impactful masters were female masters, quote unquote. And so there's a whole history there that is just starting to be written about. And I have one of those books somewhere in my library, but it's important. This is the dilemma here. This is the same dilemma as the pattern of genocide. Someone's lives, property, fortune, wealth is stolen, taken, and they are murdered. And then whoever did that pretends they didn't do that. And then whoever pretends they didn't do that, forget they're pretending. I was watching a TV show recently that my grandmother used to love. It was Perry Mason. Some of you too young to even remember that name, but a popular TV show my grandmother loved. And the thing about it was I had to convince her he wasn't a real lawyer, because there was some trouble in her business she was connected to. So, well, we can call Perry and get this. No, there's not really a Perry Mason. But anyway, I noticed you would not know there was not anything but a white world. Nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing. So the consequences of segregation is that we have been trained not to be together. We have been killed and punished for trying to be together. And so this is where courage comes in to break this pattern. One of the people you probably never heard about is a young white woman who, in seeing what happened in Selma, left her house, cooked food, went and started feeding people on the march, and the Klan spotted her and killed her on her way home. Her name is Viola, and I know that name because my mother's name is Viola. So we have been given a story. This is why the narrative has to be reconstructed. You know, you would think the civil rights movement, only black people cared, gave a damn. That's the frame.
Mm-hmm.
And every movement, every identity, every breakthrough in our understanding will be fractured by the powers that be in our perception, so that we never see the whole movement. We never see the yearning of human beings across this planet to live well, to live simply, to be kind, which I've experienced again and again around this planet. So for me, that's not some idealistic stuff. It's daily life in most of the places I've lived. And I've lived in some of the poorest places in the world, but I've also had the fortune of being on a Learjet as the only passenger, which, by the way, is very cool. But so there's not some boundary to our capacity to be human. And our status models, based on race, based on gender, on age, on location, on geography, people from that part of, and this is true all over the planet. And it's not going to help to think we can solve this here in America. We cannot. We have to solve this in our own being, in our own heart and mind. We have to come face to face in the mirror of meditation. There's a temple in Korea that some of us spent time with Thich Nhat Hanh one year, and it's a 1,000-year-old monastery way up in the mountains. And the story about it, the legend is, it was the place where abbots were trained for the Korean Buddhist movement, and that if you got trained there as an abbot, you were no joke. It was hard training. And so we stayed there. It was very cold. I won't go through the details. It was also a wonderful experience of practice. And the abbot took us on a tour the second day, took us into a room that didn't have a Buddha in it, didn't have any candles in it, didn't have any flowers in it. It had one thing on the wall. It was a mirror. And he turned to us and smiled and said, "Advanced practice." So Peggy and I came back all excited from the trip, and we decided we wanted to do a retreat using the mirrors, and people really didn't like it. people really, I don't want to look. But we've been conditioned in this country to never look because we're horrified at what we know we would see. The terror of recognizing the harm. You might remember the first time you kill something by accident, a bug, even something that tiny, and you actually felt that action,
Mm-hmm.
or you harmed someone and you felt that verbally or physically, you felt that action in your own body and in your own mind. This is where we have got to rewire. Otherwise, those actions will just repeat themselves, because for some of us, those actions release chemicals that give us pleasure.
That's unfortunate.
It is very unfortunate and very dangerous. And we all are capable of that. So I'm not talking about somebody else.
Yeah.
We all
Well,
have that wiring.
I, for one, appreciate the mirror, the image of the mirror. I just put a mirror in my meditation area.
Oh, great.
Was very deliberate that for some reason, I wanted a mirror there. So you just validated.
Good for you, Rachel. That is serious practice. I keep discovering more and more about myself that I forgot about my life and about myself. And the more I discover, the more humble I become. Because the more I review my life, I recognize my less than perfectness without blame. Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you, Larry.
Oh, the other comment I want to make for everyone that Rachel opened for me is part of our dilemma in dealing with the race issue in America, if I can use that language, is our perception, our narrative about what it means to be a good person and what it means to be a bad person. And you have to remember, we grew up in the culture of this good guy, bad guy paradigm ever since you were little. And everybody knows to be a racist is to be a bad person. Right? Now, that is a block to seeing, that is a blindness to seeing racism as systemic. So I read something in a newspaper the other day that says, the Black Lives Matter movement are trying to get white people to hate themselves. No, we're trying to get you to love your damn self, but not a fake self, a real self with real pain and real trauma and real possibility for being profound healing human beings. And in the systemic nature, and this is part of our conditioning, back to the, that was their fault again. So one of the great fears in American culture has always been to be shunned, to be disregarded in terms of your status in the community, not to be looked upon well, to be looked down on. And I can't tell you the number of people that I know personally whose lives were threatened in the 60s with bombs because I stayed in their house.
Wow.
So unless you're willing to go that deep, you're not going to unpack this. It will keep repeating. Its energy is profitable. Its energy raises some people up in their self-esteem. For me, it's a crisis of self-esteem. And my answer in Atlanta was, I don't care about being equal. I don't care about being superior. I do care about being inferior. And what I mean to say is those are all categories. And I am more than a category. I had a business potential client ask me many, many years ago when I was doing organizational consulting. Privately, he took me out and he says, well, what are you? Are you a Democrat? I said, no, I'm scarier than that. He says, well, are you a Republican? I said, no, I'm scarier than that. He says, oh, you must be an independent. I said, no, I'm a human being. full stop. I live out of my freedom and the equanimity of my heart. And we have been so preoccupied. This is colonial genius. We have been so preoccupied with who we are, we have completely ignored what we are. And therefore, what I've discovered is the biggest difficulties we have with one another has to do with what's inside of us, not what's outside of us. It is not how we appear. It is how we grow and how we learn and how we react and how we adapt, because we all do that. And so I've been in many situations in many cultures around the world, and every place I would say with great confidence, the greatest difficulty we have, even transcending language, is how to handle our nervous system's reaction to life. Our upset, our disappointments, our surprises, our joy, our fears. We don't escape these because we look different. And until we are able to practice in that ground of our own evolutionary miracle, we will keep figuring out how not to be. And that's what concerns me. And our children can feel it. Our suicide rate is up across the planet, both in numbers, in every kind of group you want to imagine, and the age is going down. 7-year-olds and 6-year-olds are committing suicide. And you think that's not a result of a whole context? I'm not mentioning adults who are suffering from the same dilemma or all the contexts in which that might occur, but I'm talking about the impact of the modern world on our humanness. And I think the key to our future, and one step anyway forward, is creating opportunities where we can rediscover our basic human kinship. Because, I worked at a hospital before, and some of you may have medical backgrounds, and I tell you, when you go in the morgue, people, there's just a tag on everybody's toe. And we're acting like fools. Really. Like children. Thich Nhat Hanh had a comment, which a lot of people don't highlight much, but in his book on the earth, says, I see us as chickens fighting over a few pieces of grain, unaware that in the next 2 hours they'll be dead. And when I say things like to my wife, she's like, "Oh, you're scaring people." I intend to. We are in a serious situation here, people. Look at our streets. And not just here. It's like the Delta variant used to be a week ago, 2 weeks ago, over there. And now it's over here. We don't even know how it got here. We are so arrogant, we think we have already figured this virus out. I think that's an error. And the error is not recognizing it as a living thing. It's adapting. We're starting to realize it's adapting and learning and growing and moving. And it's everywhere humans are on this planet. No place has escaped it. What if we looked at our lives with such a view? That we are that connected. that every human loss, every species loss, is a loss for us. I had a conversation earlier today with someone who asked me about crying. Says you must cry a lot. Well, I do every day. It's a part of my practice. I don't mean I intend to cry. I just don't shut it down, so that I keep my emotional life connected to other people's suffering, not just my own. And also then I can keep my vision of beauty not just about me, but about you.
Daryl?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ward. I deeply
Sure.
appreciate the depth of what you were saying. And I have one question or thought. I would love to hear your response, your comments. It seems to me that the neurological work that we need to do individually is connected to absorbing ourselves that terrify us or repulse us, or the ways we are. And then what that means neurologically is to be able to live with that neurological reaction to want to push that away. So it's expanding our neurological capacity,
Right.
and which is so much a part of our Buddhist practice, not being reactive,
Right.
but accepting it. Oh, my dear lizard brain, you're going crazy right now. That's okay. So I would love to hear your thoughts are expanding on that.
I
And thank you.
appreciate. Thank you. I appreciate your insight. I think you're spot on with your reflection. I think one of my cautions for people in the West around Buddhist practice is the purpose of shamatha, or calming practice, isn't simply to get you to psychologically calm down, though that's good. to find a sense of evenness in the busyness of your mind or in your emotional reactivity. But the purpose of the practice is to go deeper than that. That's part of it. But you want to go all the way to the well of equanimity. When shamatha practice is done fully body-centered, we end up with a kind of space inside of ourselves that Daryl described. A space large enough so I can work with my pain and not disrespect myself. I can work with my anger, my fear, my joy, my surprise, my heartbreak, whatever comes up. For me, it's all the same practice of having enough space to hold it, to treat it with respect, to call it by its true name, and to release it when it's ready to let go. But that the practice of meditation for me that I do every day after my 5 remembrances practices, I go outside and I practice with the trees and the hummingbirds and the plants and the ground, and I walk around with where the hawks are and other creatures as objects of meditation, as my teachers and my friends. Be amazed at what I'm learning from watching simple things. That snail is like, okay, when do I need to pull back? when do I need to slow down? When do I need to get out of the center of things and take care of myself? So we live on a planet with 1 billion teachers and nourishers of practice and depth and joy if we know how to interact with the natural world, not as an object in the sense of something I can purchase and sell, but as something that is a reflection of the miracle of living on this planet. So I do that every day. I do it every morning. I do exercises with the sun that I've made up, that I thought I made up, and I just heard a Navajo woman talk about a sun exercise. It's like, hey, I've been doing that. Wow. And you know, so there's all this in our ancestry. Look to your roots. No, I probably know more about Celtic shamanism than most white people. That's a shame. That is a powerful tradition. Really. And so, you know, it's important to understand and learn from your own spiritual roots, because it will activate some strength in you that's been lying dormant. So I studied shamanism when I was in Africa and other parts of, and then here in the U.S. with the native teachers. And for me, that's all about being connected to the earth, being an earthling. I know it's not easy being an earthling. A lot of our stories in Western thought are about not being earthlings, about living somewhere else. And I remember a story from an abbot at a Zen temple who eventually found himself with cancer, and you may have heard, you may know the story, but it's written up. And you know, his first thought was, you know, I've done everything right. I'm living a simple life. I'm eating everything I'm supposed to be eating. I'm kind. And I came down with this disease. And shortly later, he said, through his practice and meditations and silence and upset, the question came to him, who do I think I am that I'm not supposed to experience what every being on earth experiences? And when we get to that level and touch that level of our consciousness, our social change becomes possible. About 15 years ago, I had the pleasure, my wife and I were involved in a 21-day retreat in Plum Village, France, where Thich Nhat Hanh center is, primary center is. And we were involved with a group of Israelis and Palestinians who had come to Plum Village to practice together. And we began with the groups practicing separately, because it was evident, even as people came in from the airport, they could not even look at each other, which I understand, or only glance and see pain or shame or horror or hurt without words that was so deep. And so we spent a week just practicing, developing self-regulation with ourselves, learning how to come home to our bodies, recognizing and doing different forms of somatic experiences, we would call it now. And so people could find a place of self-regulation. And then the next stage was to go into co-regulation, getting the group together and sharing stories of suffering. And when the stories of suffering started being shared and people saw people they did not expect crying for them, crying for their loss, brokenhearted at their harm, things began to shift. But we have to get to that level. And in order to get to that level, we have to have safe spaces, which is difficult. So creating a safe space and safe spaces in myself every day is one thing. It's an entirely another matter to try to create a safe space where some of us can be together. Mick Wheatley talks about islands of sanity. We need to cultivate islands where when we go there, when we sit there, when we practice there, we feel well and we feel sane, as opposed to not feeling well and not feeling sane. Margaret Mead called them sapiential circles, human circles. But both of their insights are about the size. You have to think small here, especially if we're going to talk about the race thing. I've been working on this my whole life. And I can assure you, without trauma-informed training, we will get nowhere. Nowhere. Because what trauma does, when it's in our bodies, in our language, in our thinking, in our speech, and in our behavior, it activates trauma in others. This is what we're given. We look at the news. When I look at the news today, I saw trauma being passed around. Not information, not intelligence, not democracy, but trauma. Destabilization of human nervous systems a little bit everywhere. And so to me, we have a great opportunity to invent, explore new ways to be human. And some friends that I'm working and studying with are talking about understanding solidarity as spiritual practice. So we're working on what that might mean, what those specific practices might be in our experience. And then we'll be sharing that. We'll be doing some retreats and some work, for example, with Japanese Americans and African Americans, because we have healing to do among us. We have transformation to do among us. And we can. But our skills of creating safety for one another are limited. And what I mean by limited is we have no idea what creates safety for each other. This part of our nervous system gets developed so early in our lives. It's very important that as we connect, we actually have enough safety to learn a little bit about each other as individuals. Now, I'm not talking about Oprah here. I'm just talking about some basic information to help you understand Larry. Because I am not a title or position or any of that stuff. Though those things are fine, but they are just that. We are human beings, living organisms that desperately need to find a way not only to create a sense of safety among ourselves and between us. Do you know the United States as a country owns more guns, like 40% of the world's weapons? And there's some people who have enough weapons in their garage to take over a country. I know that's an exaggeration a little bit, but I'm trying to make a point. And still don't feel safe is the point I'm making. We arm ourselves with nuclear this, we arm ourselves with this, we arm ourselves, and we're still afraid. And so our world is being turned by fear. Because fear is profitable if you know how to work it. And we have to create narratives that stop rewarding. You know, it's kind of like, okay, who's the most horrifying person we can think of to put in charge? Let's choose that person. We love bullies. And then we get shocked when our children come home saying they've been bullied. This is a culture based on bullies, on abuse, on arrogance, and on harm. You think that's going to stand the ground? This is what I'm trying to say to us about inner penetrating reality of our lives. The Honey on the Rock have a great story that our ancestors are not dead. Neither are the trees and the rocks. And so this kind of recovery of my indigenous self. And as I looked at that over the years, I think part of the tragedy of colonialism, besides everything we could list, but from a spiritual perspective, colonialists were trying to kill what they call the heathen, the non-Christian, in themselves. And people still make that same spiritual error today. Our enemies are not outside of us. What will undo us is not outside. It is right here. It is right now. If we don't learn how to deal with our internal life. Because whatever is our internal life spills out into history. This is what I have learned everywhere I have been, especially my days and nights in this land. Whatever is in our internal lives comes out. It can't be hidden long. And now we're facing it another level and another way. And so take care of yourself, nourish yourself. And Dick Gregory, who's a comedian, has a great post a few months ago, and he says, before you have an argument with someone or a debate, make sure they know what that is. What? That's so good. In the New Testament, Jesus' description of that has to do with not casting your pearls before swine. When I worked with the police department, I got a personal ride the first day from the chief who was coaching me on everything. I was consulting, doing organizational consulting. He says the number one thing to know, never get into a pissing contest with a skunk, because you cannot win. Do not waste your energy. We've been conditioned to turn our attention to the people who say no. And roughly, they're not the majority. They're just loud. And when we do that, we neglect giving our support and attention to the lead birds. People on the edge, people trying to break through, people putting their lives on the line for a new world. We forget about them. And then the 80 or 70%, 60% of people in the middle will go where the wind blows. So for me, we need to be creating the energy that entices people forward. Creating the stories that call people into their best selves. Into their holiness. Into their true divinity, to use some older language. That's possible. It's happened in history in points and spots all around the planet in every culture. This is the first time we have to, enough of us as citizens have to figure out how to recover our kinship together. Our institutions are not capable of doing so. So I'm not going to spend my time, somebody asked me, what would you do about law enforcement, the criminal justice system? Well, I have a 25-point plan of what I'd say. But any plan has to have capacity, or it's just daydreaming. I learned that in sports. I learned that in every activity I've ever done. when I learned to play golf. My teacher said, everybody wants to play like Tiger Woods, but few people have the capacity. So let's figure out what your vision is and what capacity you need to build to do your vision. Great practical question. A practice. How much rehearsal is this? How much time do I devote to this? How do I get feedback? How do I refine my practice, my love in action? Where do I go and where do I put my body and my mind? I have friends who write children's books, comics, all kinds of great resources. How do we get them out? That for me has become a central question. Because what I notice is anybody who has something horrible to say about any of us can get a book out right away. So it's like, how does that work? Is there a project funding for how we self-destruct? You know, that's a part of one of the things the Buddha warned us about in our own seeds. There's a seed of pride and arrogance, and yes, but there's also the seed of self-annihilation. There's also the seed of if I can't have it, I will take it all down. And that seed is alive and well here. And in the Western world in general, if you're keeping track of voting trends and other things that are happening in other parts of quote-unquote the West. And meanwhile, our colleagues and friends in Latin America and in Africa and India are who have the growing populations in the world realize we have no way of taking care of all these people. The only outcome is going to be war and violence. This is not rocket science. And we have lived in a culture that created sustainable war. War is so important to us in our narrative that we use it for everything we're trying to do. War on drugs, war on poverty. And we used to say, where I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, in the inner city, anytime the government says it's a war on something, the actual meaning of that will come true. They're coming to destroy our neighborhoods. They're coming to destroy our lives with the war on drugs, which for others were profit on drugs. Just like incarceration. You know how much money people who are in jail are getting paid to make products for corporations that you buy? And to go through this like nothing's happening in a daze is seeding our doom. I'm not saying you should do anything crazily dramatic, but do something. Do something different. Do something small that you can do. When I lived and worked in Bangkok at the international school, anytime I was having a difficult day, because of busyness, and we had 1,000 students in 44 nationalities, we had all these languages, etc. Anytime there was a difficult meeting or whatever, I would go immediately to the Japanese kindergarten, where I got high fives from everybody. Then I'd go to the Chinese kindergarten. I'd go to all the kindergartens of all the kids. And, in 20 minutes, I was fine. I didn't care about the meeting anymore. Know how to nourish yourself every day by touching someone else's joy, someone else's play, someone else's happiness, and learn how to receive that gracefully, and learn how to give it too. I think we're out of time. Dear people, thanks for being here.